Good morning, and welcome to the Eikos Partners and Glue42 webinar, talking about application architectures for complex desktops. I'm David Gay, founder of Eikos Partners, and I'm here with James Wooster, COO of Glue42.
Thank you, David.
And for those that have joined the webinar audio only, if you're unable to run Zoom, please check the invite for details for the live YouTube stream. It is live now. Okay, so just to set the scene a little bit, providing some context around why we're doing this webinar. We have a number of business challenges as far as the complex desktop is concerned, and application UI development in general, some technical solutions, a demonstration of what we have done in collaboration with Glue, platform information, and always important tooling. So get this going, I'll hand over to James.
Okay, thanks, David. So let me just set the scene in terms of the business challenge then, and we'll walk through a number of typical scenarios that you might experience and then reflect upon what the application architecture and indeed the integration landscape would look like for each of these scenarios. So on the screen at the moment you can see that there's a highly simplified logical architecture of what an application is. 3 layers, UI, logic and data. Now, the very first thing that most organizations would have done decades ago would have been to decouple the logic and the data to allow data to exist anywhere and for individual discrete business services to be invoked from any caller. So that's a very simple example of decoupling and component-based architectures, but you'll notice the obvious thing that doesn't really affect the user interface at this stage. So let's consider the first scenario where you've got some additional business functions, some additional business capability that you would like to expose to your end users. Well, if you have an enterprise service bus or a data virtualization layer, that's quite simple. You add your new capabilities into the facade. And then, well, I guess you've got a choice with the UI. You can either extend the user interface to embrace this new capability, or you could potentially rebuild the entire user interface so that it all looks homogeneous. The choice is yours, but the risk is that you'll end up extending your application to the point where it becomes a monolithic application that is inflexible to change. If we now look at the next scenario, where we've added a net new application into the mix, again, at the data and the logic layers, you can deal with bringing those new components in. But this time, because application 2, for the sake of argument, is written in a different programming language, well, that sort of presents a bit of an issue. I mean, how do you integrate application 2, if it's .NET, with application 1, which might be Java or JavaScript? So there is a technology mismatch, but perhaps more importantly, from the end user's perspective, there's now a fragmented user experience. And so, this is a scenario that plays out up and down the land where the end user becomes the point of integration. The end user effectively is the sort of swivel chair integrator of the applications. I guess another thing to consider at this stage is, if the users keep on having new capabilities added, which are of use or significance to their daily job, how do they know that a new capability has been added? Well, I guess most people would resort to training or some kind of broadcast at that point. But wouldn't it be nice if these new applications could be discovered at runtime by the end user? The next scenario is where we look at yet another application, but this time, not only is it written in a different programming language at the UI side, it happens to be a different kind of architecture. This is a fat client application where the business logic resides on the client side, and the data, well, the data might still exist somewhere on the network, probably don't care where. So this time we've got yet another app, further fragmentation of the user experience. And now, no matter how hard you try, you can't actually use the back-end integration anymore. The back-end integration layer doesn't really apply when you've got a client-server application. And then the final step, the final scenario I'll talk about is where you've added another kind of application to the desktop. This time, it is entirely based on the client. An example of that would be perhaps Outlook or Excel or Word. These, whilst you might consider as being Office applications, they're also to many users enterprise class applications because they're fundamental to executing a user process. So looking across all of those scenarios, what we've got is a fragmented UI, back-end integration that works in some cases and not others, and a governance issue in terms of how you manage the rollout of new user interfaces. And as part of that, you need to manage how you coordinate the development teams as well. So this is a scenario that we see day in, day out. The question is, how do you solve this in a way that allows new business capabilities to be added and indeed removed at whim? David, do you want to carry on?
Yeah, absolutely. I think also, just to add a little color to that, it's not just new applications, it's also existing and legacy applications you actually want to be part of this, this new desktop. So from my perspective as CTO of Eikos Partners, I'm looking for solutions that provide me with fairly depth services layer that creates a layer between my application and my back-end services, like my microservices, my messaging, Windows management, all of those things that really go to build the sort of desktop of the future. And also it needs to be very aware that there are other technologies out there like .NET, VB, Java. We're not just a JavaScript world now. We're very much a plethora of UI technologies. So it's important that a technical solution is available to address that technical stack, the technology stack, but also to create a very well-defined layer, services layer, between the developer and the infrastructure. And that infrastructure also needs to be sort of structured in such a way that you don't have to take all or nothing. So it's very much, and we'll touch on this a little later, it's very much use the tool that's best suited for the use case in hand. So our applications, size, complexity, who actually owns the desktop real estate, these are all real issues that need to be addressed. And through governance, as James was saying, through message standards that are necessary to make applications become a lot more useful because they can share data amongst themselves without having to know specifically about who's using it or who's producing that data. And also, it's not just a case of sticking windows together. There needs to be some thought about how workspaces are constructed, what use they have for the end user, and what metrics you can actually gather that would actually allow you not only to optimize workflow and how the users use the applications, but also perhaps to discard apps that are part of your inventory that are very, very infrequently used. So there are a lot of avenues that you can explore in terms of how you put your best foot forward with regards to building what we now, or what I'm considering, are micro applications. So you have an environment that is populated with these micro apps that are able to communicate freely with each other. And so by building simple applications, you can actually construct fairly complex and well thought out workflow. Now, having said that, that's a lot to digest. So what we're going to do is we're going to do two very quick demos. One is going to demonstrate data sharing. The apps that I'm going to demonstrate to you have no prior knowledge of each other. So all they're focusing on is actual data that's being passed across between the applications, and this is Glue42's shared context. The second is a demonstration of how you can construct a workspace that is best suited for you as a user to do your daily workflow. So having set the scene, let me jump over and give you a demo. Just bear with me 1 second. Okay, so what we have is the key to all of this is the Glue42 toolbar, and in this we can discover applications that we're interested in looking at. And if we scroll through here, client contact, client list, we've got a couple that are prefixed with JSC. These are the applications that we built for this demo. So what we're going to do is, as I said, for our first little demo, we're going to show you how we can share context between applications and visual components without there being a prior knowledge. So in this data grid, I have a list here of visual components: bar chart, bubble chart, heat map, line chart, pie chart. These are actually dynamically populated in this dropdown as a result of the data from the data grid, its context being asked for the search in the application search to say, give me those applications that have some knowledge of how to process this information. So what we'll do here is let's bring up a heat map. Heat maps are always fun. So let's open that up. So using application discovery, I say I want to launch my heat map. It'll take a second or two to run. And now what I have is a heat map. And it's based on the data that's come from my grid. So this heat map knows nothing about the grid knows nothing about the heat map. But what I can show you a little bit more of is I go back to, let's pull this out. So part of the tooling that's required is window management. So I've gone from a tab view into two separate windows. I'm doing this just so that I can show you more effectively how visual changes dynamically. So let's filter this by, I only want to see everything in the year 2016. So as you can see, immediately I've entered the filter, the grid has changed, and also my heat map representation has changed as well. So again, they know nothing about each other, and yet one is able to visualize data that's been made readily available from the other. And this doesn't just apply to the heat map widget. We can also bring up a pie chart. So let's open this. And again, through application discovery, I can find out which application that I need to launch to actually render the pie chart. And again, window management, I've stuck this to the top of the data grid, and now I have a pie chart which represents for my filter data, and I'm showing it by project. So my auto, gloves, and markets. So here, that sort of concludes the first demo, where we're dealing with shared context that is published from one application and consumed by others. So let's close this down. So we've got a little bit of screen real estate. And now let's open up what is really a workspace, but on the demo here, it's called Swim Lane UI. So let's open this up. So something I prepared earlier, David's dashboard. So let's open this up. These are all applications that I've added to my workspace, and the environment remembers what workspaces you've created, what the components are, where your backend data sources are. So as you launch it, it will pre-populate itself. So here is an example of they all share the same context within the scope of the workspace. So this is a data feed, which is mimicking a ticketing system. So that's where the grid is. Now you have the bar chart. We've got a nice little bubble chart and our heat map. Now, that's all very cool. Now, let's say, you know, I don't particularly like the layout of this. I particularly want my heat map to actually be up next to my bar. So I can drag, drop it, and now I have them side by side. And then I can go and save this as another file or overwrite the workspace that's already there. What I can also do is add new. So let's do client view. And as you can see, it inserts the new app in the flow on the screen. So you've got an infinite number of possibilities here. You could also tear this out so it appears as its own separate window. There you go. So there are a lot of possibilities here, and once the user has got themselves in a situation where they feel comfortable with the layout, the workflow, how things are positioned, they can now save this workspace and then recall it at a later date when they actually need to do that particular function. And there are all sorts of other things that we can do here, but that's probably for another webinar.
Okay,
over to you, James.
Thank you, David. Let me grab back the screen if I can figure out how to do that. Just bear with me. Okay, so the reason why we showed those two demos is as David said, to illustrate 2 points. The first one was primarily around data sharing between standalone components, and the second one was about advanced window management, the ability to use very valuable screen real estate in a sensible way so that you can maximize the useful screen content for the end user. So let me just move on to a bit of a layered architecture diagram of what you've just seen. So this happens to be the Glue42 capability model. And I've highlighted in red some of the things that you've just witnessed, everything from swim lane through drag drop, flat windows, sticky windows, and so on. I guess it was a bit difficult to show sort of raw messaging, which is why the box on the left, messaging, has been highlighted. But in essence, those two demos haven't actually demonstrated the complete stack from Glue42. And the reason why I'm showing you this slide is to say that when you do application integration and develop micro applications for an enterprise, you need a great deal of support functions available to you so you can do the job well and robustly. An illustration of that would be, for the sake of argument, we can integrate to many different kinds of technology stacks, but that's a sort of language connectivity layer. There are also convenience connectors to allow you to connect to specific third-party applications or data feeds and so on. So I'm going to return to the monitoring piece in a couple of slides. But I just want to now reassure you that whilst I've given the story according to Glue42, you don't need to paint yourself into a corner. So David, I guess as a systems integrator, this is really quite important for you.
Oh, no, absolutely. I spent way too many years integrating entire platforms only for one particular feature. Anyway, so part of a good architecture is that you can pick and choose which features you want to consume from that toolkit. So if you're already fairly well along with interop using something like OpenFin, then that's fine. That's fine. And that makes sense for your use cases. Then what you can do is you can start looking at advanced window management or app directory services. So you can choose, as per this slide, you can choose a group of services that will interoperate with other technologies. And that's very, very key, because no platform, no API is able to serve every single use case that's out there. There's always going to be a gotcha somewhere. And having the flexibility of piecing things together like a jigsaw piece is perfect as far as I'm concerned. So I see advanced window management, having that flexibility using the workspaces, using OpenFin's interop layers so that you can message other OpenFin applications or other things that are running in their environment. So big thing is this infrastructure allows you not to paint yourself into a corner. You have a great deal of flexibility. And as we've seen with the demo, we've only touched on a few pieces. And those pieces do not infiltrate the entire application. They're very localized, which means that if you need to swap shared context for a message bus, for example, then that's very, very doable. You're not kind of put into a situation where you have to use this.
Yeah. So just a quick word for those in the audience who aren't from these financial services space. A really good example of what David has just said is this thing called FDC3. FDC3 is a collection of working groups that are defining a set of standards for various things you might need when integrating applications at the UI and data layer. So, for example, there's a working group for app directories. There's a working group for application intents and discovery and so on. So every time the standards bodies release a new implementation, a new API, we will embrace that as quickly as we can. Now, I just want to move on to something a little bit different. So it's all well and good managing the UI, doing the data integration, building micro applications. But one of the things that we think is really important is having a collection of tools that go with the platform that allow you to, for example, monitor memory usage, CPU utilization, and from my perspective, UI navigation across and between the applications or within and across applications. So I'm going to focus now on the yellow layer on this diagram called monitoring. So one thing that you were perhaps unaware of was that when David was running his demonstrations, every time an application was started or indeed stopped, every time a window within an application received focus or lost focus, we're recording those events in a massively scalable distributed file store. And what we've done on screen at the moment is something that was built in-house at Glue42, just to take some of that data and display how the user's journey is progressing between applications. This is a very simple directed graph. And the orange circles you can see are the dominant applications, where size is in proportion to the total time spent in those applications. And if you look very carefully, I realize it's not massively clear, you can see arcs between those orange circles, which is the transition from one application to another. Now, as I said, this was just a homegrown in-house sort of proof of concept, but things have progressed quite significantly. So one of our customers, they happen to use ClickSense for their analytics and reporting. And where we're going with our platform is to make sure that all of that monitoring data is easily accessible via a third-party tool of the customer's choice. So on the left-hand side, I've got a screenshot of a Click report, which is showing a couple of fairly simple metrics. The top left-hand one is total runtime of an application, and the one sort of middle left is time spent with focus. It's amazing the kind of things you can do once you've captured that data for each of the applications. And some example queries are shown in the table on the right-hand side. Let me illustrate the point for you. So if you see that applications have been Glue-enabled but not used, well, perhaps that suggests either a misunderstanding about the purpose of the application, or perhaps the application is not used because it's not required, in which case maybe you can remove that from your environment and decommission. If you understand what good looks like, so for example, you have a user in your team that is great at selling or supporting a customer. If you baseline their transitions between the applications, examine which applications they use and how long they spend in those applications, you can baseline good. And if you can baseline good, you can understand the deltas from good that relate to the behaviors of other users. So you can quite easily start to rate users according to either best practice or compliance or some other metric. The final thing is that any application at any time can choose to insert into the monitoring data additional information about the application or the business context. For example, it could choose to push into the metrics monitoring file details about the customer ID or the instrument or the product or whatever it might be. Now, clearly, you're not going to do that if it's highly sensitive data, but in some cases, putting that into the log file then allows you to view users' behavior according to business outcomes, like which of my traders generated most revenue for a particular customer. So that just illustrates one of the benefits of having a full service enterprise stack for application integration. So, hey, David, just in summary then, I think what we've shown here is that integration at a back end is a tried and tested
Absolutely.
Sort of process and technique that has been used for decades.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the same level of standards creation and standards adoption has not yet arrived at the user interface, although thankfully in financial services things are beginning to change.
Yes.
So what this means, I guess, is that people over time can now have the luxury of reconsidering what an application is. It doesn't need to be a 20-page monolithic application anymore.
No, absolutely not. You have, with applications that are built currently, the current philosophy is deployments become an issue. There's no isolation of functionality. So all boring things that we care about as developers, testability, reliability, so on and so forth, and reusability as well. Mm. That moving away from these very high-level applications to something that's more specifically focused on function, as with microservices, then it actually makes it a lot easier to provide reliability and testability for your applications. And also, you could start building your Uber app, for want of a better word, and with monitoring, with the metrics that you collect, you can actually refine how the application is presenting data, what applications are available. So it becomes a very living, breathing, evolutionary approach to delivering functionality to your end users. And given the sophistication that end users are used to now, that you really do put the power back in their hands so that they actually have control over how they do their job.
Cool. Well, look, thank you everyone for joining the webinar. The final slide here. If you want to know more about Eikos, then their website is at the top of the page. And also, if you are interested in doing an evaluation on the Glue42 environment, then that's very easy too. Go to glue42.com/desktop enterprise and just hit the request demo button.